What if I told you Britain's takeover of India was 2,000 years in the making? It sounds insane, but let me give you some context. I'm Indian American, and I grew up with two versions of this story. The Indian version, where the British were pure villains, evil incarnate. And the Western version, where the British civilized the subcontinent. Colonialism was a gift. I never bought into either, because both versions have the same problem. They're too simple. History is a Game of Thrones, and in this season, we are going to see how a trading company from an island half the world away came to a subcontinent and conquered the richest civilization on Earth. To understand this, we have to take an honest and uncomfortable look at how civilizations evolve, the destiny of geography, along with the brilliance and brutality of humanity. This is how Britain actually took over India. So most videos or articles about this topic usually start with the same thing, the British first landing in Bengal. But there's a much more interesting tale that happened before it. Because this story is fundamentally a clash of two peoples and how they changed over time. One was ascendant, the other was descendant. And nowhere can I illustrate that more than beginning with Caesar's invasions of the island of Britannia. Roman chronicles describe this as the edge of the known world, filled with barbarians who were barely clothed and liked rolling around in mud. The people painted their faces blue, lived in earthen huts, and even committed human sacrifice. So obviously a fairly backward place, even in ancient times. Contrast this with India in the same period. It was the richest civilization in the world, accounting for 1/3 of the world's GDP share. The same Romans who invaded Britain complained of their treasures being emptied for Indian luxuries. Indian scientific advancement was top tier with pioneering medical breakthroughs, the greatest steelwork on the planet. Anyway, we begin here because I want to make the point that people are not innate. They rise and fall in cycles. And India's fall begins with three main things that hollowed it out before the British even arrived. And it all starts with a volcano in El Salvador. You see around 536 AD, a Central American supervolcano called Ilopango erupted, causing a mini ice age across the world. In India, that meant the ceasing of monsoons, causing huge crop failures and famines. At the same time, the Guptas, a large Indian empire and architect of India's golden age, were also collapsing. So India begins to de-urbanize. Grain is short with the monsoons failing, so people leave cities to go to villages and farm to get food. And it's here where India's infamous caste system really calcifies. Geneticists note that prior to this era, there was a lot more fluidity in terms of people mixing. But around this time, the caste system became much more rigid, probably because India was becoming more rural. Now almost every other contemporary society had a class or caste system. But India's caste system became particularly strict. Society turned less on an individual level. While caste could experience social mobility, an individual could not. This also meant India's knowledge was more and more siloed into specific castes. You wouldn't meet as many artisan becomes banker becomes intellectual types that drove European innovation come later. Thus, India further fragmented. Nonetheless, India was still doing relatively well versus other lands. The 9th century Arab traveler Al-Yaqubi notes that the Indians were in wisdom superior to all other nations. Indian concepts like zero, the numeral system we use today, and various other scientific breakthroughs were absorbed by Arabs, leading to ancient historians like Al-Masudi describing how hikmah, or wisdom, originally came from Al-Hind, or India. Yet a few hundred years later, things became different. By that time, another famous historian named Al-Biruni describes how science ceased in many parts of India, and the land had fallen into ruin. So what happened? Well, Al-Biruni was describing the Islamic invasions of India. And I want you to pause to recognize this. Al-Biruni is not some Indian nationalist. He is a Muslim foreigner in the court of the invader, describing how terrible and devastating the invasion was. He's lamenting what's going on here. So India really started to recede with the catastrophe of these invasions. Now, to understand the last factor here, we have to examine what happened when some of these invaders settled in India post-conquest. The big issue was many of these empires did not care for Indian science or development, but were rather empires of extraction. Their leaders saw the essential divide between Hindu and Muslim, or Turk and Indian, and as a result, many didn't identify with the common populace. That's why you see such grand monuments from this age, because these empires were insanely unequal. Economists have noted how the Mughal state was extremely extractive, where 655 individuals amassed 61.5% of the imperial revenue. Its inequality extraction ratio, a measure that shows what percentage of a state's economic surplus the ruling class seizes, was a gobsmacking 97.1%. That meant for every 100 rupees generated, the Mughal ruling class was taking 97 for itself, basically leaving nothing for reinvestment into mass development or peasant welfare. Because of this, the economic historian Angus Maddison describes the Mughals as parasitic, and considering the data, I understand why. So this crushing inequality and lack of investment in terms of development was the situation for many Indians on the eve of British conquest. And we have many corroborations of all this from various merchants, missionaries, and travelers that remark the shocking levels of destitution of India at that time. So it's important because even before the British came, India's GDP share of the world was shaved 10% by the end of Islamic rule, from 33% to 23%. India was a land in decline. But what about our British lads back on the Isle? How did they go from painting their faces blue to ruling every inch of blue on the map? This is the part where we gotta be real and talk about the excellence of the Englishmen. I think history has to be objective. And I'll start off by saying, while I am an opponent of colonialism and not a fan of the British Raj, I'll explain why later, the British were a brilliant, brilliant people. And understanding why they were brilliant, why they won, is more important than being angry about colonization. To comprehend that, we have to go back in history and examine what made the British. And again, with three main reasons. While various groups migrated to the Isle after Caesar's invasion, Britain really started to become one with the advent of English common law, a mechanism that made contracts enforceable regardless of who you were. This is kind of a precursor to equality before law. Its advent empowered common English citizens and made them feel a part of the kingdom. It made them feel English rather than just from their locality. England, the core of Britain, started to unite through wars and this legal system. So while India fragmented, Britain centralized. Next, the British imported some brilliant ideas, mainly from the Dutch. You see, in 1688, a Dutch prince invaded England and became king, but only on the condition of acceding some power to Parliament. Thus, Britain began to build real institutions rather than rely on a single monarch for legitimacy, the most important of which was the Bank of England. And what really supercharged this bank were the Dutch financiers that the Dutch prince brought with him. Decades prior, these same Dutchmen created a slew of financial innovations and instruments like joint stock companies, national debt, paper money, etc. These all were implemented by the British in the Bank of England, causing an economic revolution. One of the big ventures that the Bank of England gave loans out for, and had companies chartered for, was the colonization of the Americas, something that became extremely profitable. Yet how would the British get there, and how would they defend their trading fleet? Well, the British decided to raise the Royal Navy. The sheer investment into this endeavor led Britannia to rule the seas and thereby rule global trade. And all of this was again due to the institutions and elites who had a vision beyond just taxing some peasant or personal glory. They believed in not just the idea of England or Britain, they believed that it was Britain's duty to be excellent, to spread their ideas and power across the world, to civilize others. India, on the other hand, did not have elites who really thought like this, at least at scale. So this kind of all made a flywheel. The Bank of England funded colonial ventures, which brought back more money, which helped fund the Navy that brought even more money in for the bank. With so much excess capital, British elites invested in things like science and technology and the pursuit of knowledge, not simply to further colonial aims, but also for the pursuit of knowledge itself. The British created systematic records and knowledge bases for everything, from financial methods, to shipbuilding, to cartography, to botany, and anything in between. It's what led them to things like the Enlightenment and Industrial Revolution, while Indian elites were either fighting each other or in a dick measuring contest on who could build the biggest mausoleum. The British and Indians were structurally different people because they had a Grand Canyon of a difference in terms of elites. And that all came to the fore when the British set their sights on India. Because even though India had declined, it was still a massive source of luxury goods in the world. Textiles, spices, and so much more enticed the British to finally make that trek out to the subcontinent. What the British didn't know was just how ripe the land was for the taking. The East India Company did not imagine it would conquer all of Bengal or Delhi or the entire subcontinent. What happens next is a dance between chance and choices, and how that duet changed the song of the subcontinent forever. The reason the British conquered India was actually because of the French. No more backstory now, I swear, okay? We are in India in the early 18th century. The East India Company had set up some trading posts in places like Bengal, Bombay, and crucially, Madras, which was near the vicinity of a French colony, Pondicherry. The East India Company didn't really have a formal army, just some light security personnel, usually a minority of British soldiers leading native Indian mercenaries. But in Madras, the British witnessed something. The French governor of Pondicherry got into a conflict with the Nawab of Madras and wrecked him with a much tinier force. The reason for this was because of European military tactics. You see, Europeans, as well as Indians trained by them, were much more disciplined in combat. The French and British had formal military academies that drilled their soldiers to fire muskets with discipline, to organize ranks systematically, and stay steady under fire. Again, the edge was down to institutions. The British saw how European-trained armies could take on much larger Indian forces, even though the technology difference was not that large. So the East India Company started raising an army, and mostly filled with Indians themselves. Now this is a huge theme for the tale. Indians helped conquer other Indians. While the leadership of these armies were mainly British, the mass was Indians trained in European methods. But why did so many Indians join this army? Well, Indian rulers, especially around Bengal, where a lot of East India Company activity was, had a habit of paying their soldiers late, if at all. The rulers of these regions saw soldiers as fickle and unpredictable, so they basically nickel and dimed them. So what the British did was actually pay these soldiers on time and also drill them into discipline with those European methods we saw earlier. And eventually, when it was time to actually test this force, they would pass that test with flying colors. The exam was in Madras. The French and British are backing different local Indian rulers for control of the territory. With the British position under siege, a clerk-turned-soldier named Robert Clive audaciously takes the capital with just 500 men. An army of thousands tried to take the capital fort, but Clive and crew held out for 53 days till reinforcements arrived. That moment sparked the beginning of Britain's ambitions for domination. It gave not just Clive, not just the East India Company, but also backers in London the confidence to invest in an even larger force for more audacious moves. The East India Company would then announce its intentions at a place called Plassey in Bengal. Clive, fresh from his victory in Madras, assembled 3,000 troops, 800 Europeans, and 2,100 Indians against an army of 50,000 men. Now, historians think those numbers are probably exaggerated, but the British were outnumbered. One of the funniest aspects of this fight was that it was kind of decided by a slap.
How can you slap? How can you slap?
Okay, not that one though, I love that meme. Prior to Clive fighting the Nawab of Bengal, the Nawab slapped the head of the Jagat Seth banking family publicly in court, then the wealthiest in his kingdom. To avenge this insult, the Seth coordinated with the EIC to pay off a section of the Nawab's army and stand down during the fight. So once the armies actually clashed, the Nawab's formation and strategy collapsed with the retreat of the traitor regiments, while Clive's European-drilled infantry destroyed the remainder of the Nawab's army, forcing it to flee. The British were said to have only had 22 casualties and 50 wounded. The East India Company had announced itself as a juggernaut. Soon it began taking on different empires and armies one by one, starting in the east of India, then south, then the massive Maratha Empire covering India's north and west, and finally capturing northwest India. And often, the British were playing these empires against each other and switching allegiances. And this part is really underrated. Indian kingdoms were at each other's throats for centuries. And now a new force comes in with an insanely effective army and riches. So the British would play the broker between kingdoms, and once the time was right, they'd just take them over with a combination of military and financial might. Sociologist Marshall Salins calls this method the stranger king phenomenon, where a colonial power would arrive as a neutral broker but eventually take over all sides outright. They do this across India, and many times they did lose or had to settle for a stalemate, yet they kept pushing. But what separated the East India Company's army, beyond military tactics, was also how extractive it was in areas it conquered or kingdoms it subjugated. After the initial conquest of Bengal, its tax revenue was immediately transferred to the EIC. And here's the insane part. The Bengali tax revenue then funded every subsequent British war in India. The conquest of Mysore, the destruction of the Marathas, the annexation of Punjab. Each new territory was squeezed for taxes in addition to the East India Company taking over businesses and thriving industries like textile factories or spice farms. India did not only get conquered, but it paid for its own conquest. Meanwhile, London was living large off these profits as its leaders could not believe the success and riches emanating from India. And now I think we really have to go down this economic rabbit hole. Because while the British conquered India with guns, they oppressed it with policies. This is the number that everyone is claiming the British took from India, 45 trillion. But the truth is, that number is wrong. Now that doesn't mean British rule was a blessing. As we'll see, British rule was a multi-part calamity for the country. And the first element of this was the drain. While 45 trillion is fake, the flow of money from India to Britain was absolutely real. The scholar Dadabhai Nauroji noted how 1/3 of India's revenue was captured by Britain in the form of salaries, pensions, and general payments to British officers. Yes, that means Indian tax revenue was paying for its own colonization. Critics of this line of logic claim that a lot of the revenue was spent on India itself, whether via schooling or infrastructure or the infamous railroads. But neutral observers like the American historian Will Durant tell a different tale. Let's start with the classic railroad argument. Durant notes how the British monopolized ownership of the railroads but forced the costs on Indians. And while these railroads lost money every year, almost 100 million in debt at the time Durant saw them, the British kept them up with Indian revenues. The railroads were primarily made for the extraction of India, where Indian raw materials would be taken not to local factories to encourage industrialization, like what was happening in Japan at the same time, but to be shipped off to British factories. Keep this industrial point in mind as eventually we'll get to it, and it is extremely damning. But perhaps the least covered aspect of British rule was the expenditure on the British Indian Army. Durant labels them an army of fratricide, and that's because of what we saw earlier. It was an army of Indians killing other Indians. In 1926, the British Indian Army's cost was gargantuan, nearly 200 million, a tax of 3% on the earnings of every man, woman, and child in the land. And it's not like this army was defending India or even oppressing other Indians. It was used in British war efforts abroad. During the 19th century, India paid 450 million for wars fought for England outside of India with Indian troops, and sent 800,000 soldiers plus 400,000 laborers to defend the British Empire during World War I. This was an insane drain of resources for India simply to help Britain colonize other countries. One of the results of this drainage was the preponderance of famines in British India. And look, it's not like famines didn't happen prior to British India. They did. But as the historian Mike Davis notes in his book, Late Victorian Holocaust, the famines from 1976 to 1902 killed somewhere between 5 to 12 million Indians. Overall, British India suffered 30 major famines in 120 years, an even worse record than the famously extractive Mughals. India's per capita income remained stagnant or even declined during a century of British rule, while Britain's exploded during its industrialization. And here's the final point of the economic case, this idea of industrialization. The British systematically dismantled Indian textile factories and other manufacturing elements via crushing taxes and tariffs. They slapped an 85% tariff on Indian textiles entering Britain, a product that had dominated global markets for centuries. Meanwhile, British goods entered India at 3.5%. This ceased any hope of Indian industrialization. As I pointed out earlier, Japan created railroads to bring its own materials to its own factories, thereby expanding its manufacturing base and economic power. But India was barred from doing this via colonial policies and forced British monopolies on manufacturing. The result is a drop in GDP share of 23% to 4% by the end of British rule. And again, this is not simply due to a drain, but also a lack of industrialization. But that's just one aspect of this calamity. The most underrated impact of British colonization is actually how they fundamentally changed Indian society. So this is going to be the most interesting part of the video because I've never seen anyone really talk about this. But that's exactly what we're going to do here. Prior to colonization, scholars like Dharampal note that education was fairly widespread in India, across all castes actually. He found that in eastern India, there was roughly one school per 400 inhabitants, a ratio comparable or even better than England in the same time period. But the British would upend the system. Indian children were not made for schools, they were made to work in fields. Crushing taxes and policies caused a 66% drop of schools after a century of British rule. And as Will Durant notes further, only 4% of children went to school at any point. This dismantled Indian high culture and mores. The population receded into stupor. Those that could get educated were fashioned to be brown Englishmen, a phrase used by another British administrator, Thomas Macaulay, to describe those Indian in appearance but British in taste, culture, and thought, intellectual foot soldiers of the empire. Those groomed to help the British Raj oppress their own people. And that they did. One of the biggest ways this occurred was through the calcification of caste. Now, as we talked earlier, the caste system is ancient, but what the British did was make it even more rigid. They arbitrarily combined castes into groups and assigned preferential policies to them depending on how loyal they were. This resulted in things like the Criminal Tribes Act, where entire groups were labeled as criminal simply off of their birth alone. The historian Nicholas Dirks notes a specific example where a caste in South India, the Kalars, would be randomly picked up off the street and jailed if a crime happened in their vicinity. Not because they did anything, because of what they were born as. And this highly damaged India's social fabric. Professor Ajay Verghese notes that even today, former British provinces experience significantly more violence between caste groups than those ruled via vassalage by Indian princes. Even at the dawn of independence, the British would sabotage Indian efforts of freedom by constantly favoring the Muslim League. Something the scholar Dr. B.R. Ambedkar meticulously notes, as the British incited extremist Muslim factions to antagonize Hindus and even help the British. And while Hindu-Muslim relations were not a utopia prior to colonization, the open encouragement of an extremist faction like the Muslim League, just to spite India at large, left a massive parting shot: the partition of India. So at this point, I know I'm kind of dogpiling on the British. Like, I don't like colonialism. I think it was bad, and the evidence seems to suggest that as well. But I do want to speak on the other side. There are some ways that the British had a positive impact on India. The introduction of English, now the world's premier language, gives India a lot of economic pull today, including via its burgeoning tech industry and global diaspora. Indian ideas are going to become global ideas because they're being spoken in English. British institutions, while definitely being designed to rule instead of granting rights, helped India navigate its turbulent early years as a country. And that type of state capacity is really underrated when it comes to running a country. And even today, a lot of their infrastructure still holds up, including the railroads. But all in all, I don't think any of these positive aspects actually outweigh the devastation of colonialism. Yes, the positives are real, but they don't balance the ledger. Yet beyond all that, I want to end on something that I think captures this story a whole lot better than any statistic. When Caesar landed in Britain, Indians were calculating the circumference of the earth. 2,000 years later, the British sailed the earth and crushed India under their feet. Yet the British don't hold sole responsibility here. At the end of the day, this is a tale where Indians screwed over other Indians, where divisions, a lack of institutions, and nearsightedness paved the way for an island to conquer a subcontinent. Indians have themselves to blame, ultimately. That's the real cost of colonialism. Not just what was taken, but the potential that was shattered. Luckily, India is still here though. Battered, complicated, frustrating, but hopeful. And now it's finally ascending. The question now isn't about blame. It's about whether India understands clearly enough what was broken, so it actually knows what needs fixing.